I'm the only one who gets to do that. Okay, ready?
See, at least the lights are LED. It would all be misty.
If these lights were spinning, I think I'd be on acid.
There you go.
They are spinning.
Why is that one so bright, that one light?
The angle.
I hope you weren't smoking
I
before you
didn't
got
do
here.
You see the cannabis pen?
I need my sunglasses.
Exactly.
I do, I know, I need my glasses.
And the one next to yours was so bright for me.
Well, you just have to look at us and not look at the lines.
All right, Andrew, stop and re-roll.
So we have 2 cameras.
All right, stand by, everybody. We're going to do take 2 and slate.
Good evening. Welcome, everyone, to the Broward County LGBT Oral History Roundtable. This program was made possible with generous support from the John C. Graves Charitable Fund and the Gay and Lesbian Broward Community Fund of the Community Foundation of Broward County, our fund, an LGBT Community Foundation, and the support of the Fort Lauderdale,
Sorry, just pick it up. We'll be able to cut.
all right, the Community Foundation of Broward, our fund, an LGBT Community Foundation, and the support of the Fort Lauderdale City Commission, and the support of Fort Lauderdale City Commissioner Dean Trentalis. I'm Fred Fegis. I'm a professor at Florida Atlantic University where I teach LGBTQ studies. I would like to introduce our panel. First, we have Dean Trentalis on our right. Dean is a Fort Lauderdale City Commissioner and a mayoral candidate and has a 35-year-long track record of public service which began with his involvement in the fight for equal rights. An attorney with deep roots in South Florida's LGBTQ community, Dean has been a champion for our community's civic and cultural development. David Stack is president of the Dolphin Democratic Club from 1994 to 1996. He was an openly gay delegate to the Democratic National Convention in 1996 to re-elect Clinton Gore, a member of Americans for Equality, which added LGBT rights to the community. A member of the Americans for Equality, which added LGBT rights to the Broward County. Okay. Member of Americans for Equality, which added LGBTQ rights to the Broward County Charter, a former member of the Broward County Democratic Executive Committee, and a Get Out the Vote coordinator for the first openly gay candidate to run for Fort Lauderdale City Commission, Ken Wolf. Denise Giselle, a tireless South Florida activist who is now enjoying the fruits of her labor by being happily married to the love of her life. Denise was a member of GUARD, the Dolphin Democrats, and the Broward County Human Rights Board. Norm Kent. Norm has been an advocate for gay rights who has appeared as a commentator on CNN, The Nancy Grace Show, and Fox News. He is presently the publisher of the South Florida Gay News and a member of the National Gay Media Association and the largest LGBT newspaper in the state of Florida. And Bodiford. She was instrumental in amending the Broward County Human Rights Ordinance to include sexual orientation in 1995 and the Broward County Civic Domestic Partnership Ordinance in 1999. She participated in numerous civic and political boards and is a monthly contributor to numerous South Florida publications between 1993 and 2007, which documented our political struggle and progress. This evening we're going to be talking about the LGBT community in South Florida, and particularly in Broward County. While we'll be getting into many of the political developments that occurred in the 1980s, the 1990s, and the early 2000s, first we'd like to talk about what it was like to be lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender in South Florida during this era. And I would like to sort of call upon each person here to sort of talk about what they remember from that period in their lives when they were living here in Broward County. First, I want to start with Dean.
Well, it's a really general question, but I'll do my best to try to respond. I think we all had the same kind of experience, unaccepting community. We like to think of ourselves as a diverse community, but back in the 1980s, while we did have a very active gay life and lots of bars, lots of restaurants, I think that we kind of kept to ourselves and had a very enjoyable but isolated lifestyle. I know when I first started practicing here in 1982, I really wasn't out to the community. I wasn't out to the legal community, and it was only later, during my activism 10 years later, that I made myself known as to be an openly gay individual. So it wasn't really as I would say as embracing as we might see it today.
Good.
Thank you, Fred, and thank you for the invitation. I always thought of Broward County, especially in the 90s, as being very democratic, very liberal, and an easy place to live, an accepting place. For me, keeping my gay identity separate from work, so not being out really at work, but being out in the community and for activism. We're going to talk about the 80s, we have to mention AIDS because of the devastation that it had to the community, where hundreds of people died, and especially people that were very active in the community. And so that brought us a lot together, But in the 90s, there was an activism and a desire to go forward and to move forward and to claim our rights. And so and we felt secure in doing that because of the liberal democratic base that we have here in Broward County. That's all. Thank you.
Fred, I moved here in the early 1980s, and at that time, I think we were pretty fragmented. We had a few places that we know we could go and find our kind and socialize and meet people and participate together in all kind of activities. But those were very specialized locations, bars, some stores. So, and it wasn't until things became more difficult for us to just live our daily lives that we became more galvanized, more activated to do something about to change that, so we could really widen our landscape of living here in Broward County.
Norm.
If I were to put out a few words that summarize the late 70s to the 90s, almost as bullet points, I would tell you that in the 70s, the defining gay word was hedonism. People came down here from Key West to South Florida to enjoy themselves, to assert their sexual identity, to party at places like the Copa or the Monster Bar in Key West. And it was adversity, the next bullet point, and AIDS, starting with the awareness that was cultivated in San Francisco all the way down to South Florida, that led to activism. The Briggs Amendment, where they said you can't teach in a public school if you're a homosexual. The Anita Bryant Crusade in 1979, where Dade County, behind Ruth Jack, passed the gay rights ordinance, and then they had a fight to keep it in place because the citizens sought to overturn it. Something that Dean and Robin would encounter 18 years later in Broward County when they had a fight for the repeal, against the repeal of civil unions. So the bullet points started out in the late 70s with hedonism. Then you had AIDS, which led to activism. And then in the 90s, you had more people coming out, like David Stack, who said, I've been in a relationship 10, 20, 30 years. Norm Kent might have thought we're just hedonistic, but gay men have been couples for decades, and we've been silent for too long, and now we want to assert who we are, we want to reflect what our accomplishments have been, and we want to go from being on the back pages of the newspaper to the front pages. We don't want to be rated and ruled, we want to be respected and revered. And we've come, like that Virginia Slim cigarette commercial said in the 1980s, we've come a long way, baby.
Well, that's a hard one to follow up on, but I'll do my best. For me, my story is a little different. I grew up in Miami, and I came out in Miami-Dade County. It was Dade County at the time, in 1973, and that was in the midst of the, I think, 74, 75, the whole Ruth Shack and Nita Bryant debacle. And my brother and I escaped to California in 76. And so we were young in Miami, we went to the bars, we had a great time. We hardly noticed that our parents weren't speaking to us, and I was thrown out of the house. And who noticed? Who cares? He'd hide in the golf course, I'd pull up in my Volkswagen, he'd throw himself in the back seat, and we'd tear off, and he'd spend the weekend with me. I mean, we had fun. And then we went off to California, and he really had fun, because that's where, you know, I mean, they already had a lot of the rights, or they were moving much more rapidly toward the rights that we haven't even barely begun to dream about here. And I stayed in California until my brother passed away in 91, and I came back here. And so for me, my Broward experience was returning here, angry, hurt about my brother's passing, about his passing with the President of the United States never having said the word AIDS. And I turned that anger and grief into my political activism here. So I really can't speak to what was going on here in the 80s, but when I got here in the 90s, people were fighting back. We had that boo ad, which I only came in on when it was over. So can't speak to that, but certainly the fight had started here, and I was fortunate enough to get it on the ground level of what really turned into a renaissance in gay rights in Broward County in the 90s. It was tremendously exciting, and most of us were idealists with little or no, interestingly, it was politics, but I didn't know it was politics. I just thought it was fighting for my rights and for my dignity. Here I came back here, I'm a lawyer, and I have to go to a commissioner and beg her to give me the right to say I'm gay at my job. So it was crazy, and I'm looking forward to talking about it tonight. But we were innocents. I know David and I, we were recruited to serve on a Dolphin Democratic Club, was a gay club, and it had almost disappeared. And this woman, Sue Messenger, recruited a bunch of neophytes to serve on the board. Her neighbor, who was this little straight lady, me, I'd never done anything with David, had never, and we took over and we made gay rights in Broward County, and it's a great story.
We made history, yes.
We did, so we're gonna talk about it tonight.
Well, a number of you mentioned or alluded to the fact that either you were in the closet at one point, or you were dealing with the fact that, as you mentioned here, that there are these people in power who just would rather ignore you. What was the whole process of either being closeted or your perception of the environment out there? I mean, was it capable of finding friends? If I was a straight person and I wanted to say to a gay person, hey, I support you, how would you have done it then?
Let me answer one thing right away that would affect Rob and myself. Dean, 1978, when I came down here, it was illegal to be a gay lawyer. You admitted you were a lawyer and you were gay, aside from the fact that the American Psychiatric Association still considered homosexuality a mental disability, and while they were right about then transitioning, the Florida bar considered you a deviant, and there was a case that had to go all the way to the Supreme Court of the state of Florida before attorneys could admit they were gay and practice law. A very well-respected lawyer at the University of Miami handled it, but you were forced into a closet against your will, even if you were an open advocate for gay rights. And using an example which a lot of people remember early in 1982, the Todd Shuttleworth days. Here you had a librarian in Broward County who had contracted HIV, who was fired and terminated from his job by the Broward County Commission because they didn't want somebody who had HIV passing books out to the general public. That's how repressive it was.
It was paranoia. It was paranoia. Even within the gay community, though, we were all paranoid because no one knew how to contract it. No one knew the methodology. So what Robin has said and what Norm has said is very interesting because there were two levels of lifestyle. We had our own personal lifestyle. We had our hedonistic way of just enjoying ourselves and hanging out with our friends and our places. And there were lots of them in Fort Lauderdale at the time. And there was no such thing as a Miami scene. You know, there was very little going on. There was either Key West or Fort Lauderdale in the 80s. And so we were very excited to be here. But when you woke up the next morning and you had to go to work, you had a totally different persona. You weren't the gay person anymore. You tried to fit in, as everyone tries to fit in, especially when they're younger. And I think that eventually melded to the point where in the 90s, we finally realized that we were going to self-identify as gay and lesbian. Back then it was gay or lesbian. And we took pride in that, as Robin said. And I think in 1995, when we finally were able to get the Equal Rights Ordinance passed at the county level, and then Americans for Equality was established to try to defeat the signature campaign to overturn that ordinance, you know, the community was very successful in seeing the defeat of that. And honestly, you know, I don't think there was much strength behind their effort, so it made us realize that Broward County was changing, and Broward County was becoming much more embracing and of diversity. So, as Robin said, the 90s were a very exciting time, the gay 90s under Clinton. It was really a wonderful time, and a lot of new things were happening, and we rode that wave. And I'd like to say that everybody here who was part of it helped steer that, and in their own way, whether it be in the gay community, the lesbian community. Transgendered rights were not as much talked about back then, and I think that it's great that we're now doing that because I think it's important to be inclusive of rights for everybody. And I think that the idea that, you know, that we were able to rise like everybody else, we saw it happening around the country. Robin mentioned BUAD, which was Broward United Against Discrimination. That was an effort in 1992 by the American Family Association. They were doing a petition drive around the state to put on the ballot at the state level to deny each city and county the right to establish equal rights ordinance for gay and lesbian individuals. They ultimately lost because the Supreme Court determined that the language on the ballot was not legal, and we can thank Land to Legal for helping us with that effort, if I remember correctly. And we were able to defeat that in 1992. But Broward United Against Discrimination was Broward's engagement and involvement in the statewide effort. We used to go to Orlando every week or two, meeting together as a state to try to defeat that effort. That was ultimately the formation of Save Dade, as many people now here know it as Save, but that's how Save Dade first started. And here in Broward, we kind of just let that organization go because we already had the Dolphin Democratic Club, so we didn't really need to overlap on different clubs.
I would just jump in and
Just
point out that these things and accomplishments that you referred to in the 90s, that you and David, Denise, that Robin experienced. Fred's a history teacher. Without the adversity of the AIDS epidemic, you might not have been empowered to be there, because the AIDS epidemic taught the gay community that if we're going to speak up, we have to speak up for ourselves. We had a president, Ronald Reagan, who wouldn't mention AIDS between 1981 and 1987. When I wrote a column in the Weekly News about Rock Hudson getting AIDS, I got a letter from the Florida bar advising me I might be giving improper legal advice about.
Well, but AIDS
So-
pulled many of our community out of the closet. There's no doubt about it.
That's my.
The
that's my-
demonstrations, the resentment, it pulled a lot of people out of the closet.
There was what was the silence equals death?
Right.
Was the
Act
posters.
Up.
Act up. So the people on the edge that I represented as a criminal defense lawyer, the people coming out of the closet made the difference. We had a radio talk show host that I was attorney for 35 years, who came out July 4th, 1976, on the air, Neil Rogers, on WIOD. They said it would end his career. By the time his career ended in 2009, he was the highest paid talk show host in South Florida at $1.5 million a year. Just last year, Talkers Magazine, 8 years after his death, referred to Neil as one of the top 15 talk show hosts in America. So it was speaking out, standing up, and being counted that made the difference.
So when you talk about Todd Shuttleworth, because his case is really quite important when it comes to AIDS and I think the Americans with Disability, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, because you mentioned it earlier, but you did. Some people may not know.
Well, I was just trying to point out that aside from gay men being raided in bars, and I fought in 1982 when Virginia Young was mayor of Fort Lauderdale, I represented 6 gay bookstores that sold those little videos where you'd sit and watch videotapes. They were raided by the Fort Lauderdale police, and they used the RICO Act, which is Racketeer Influence Corruption Organization Act, a 10-year first-degree felony, to raid all the gay owners in those businesses. It was the first time RICO had ever been used against obscenity, which was a misdemeanor. A lot of people risked going into the gay bookstore business, selling products, candidly, whether it was dildos or sex toys or videotapes, because it was a misdemeanor. No one ever thought they'd be facing 10 years in jail and a first-degree felony. But the Fort Lauderdale police raided them. The Broward Sheriff's Office used to entrap gay men that would meet people in parks. If you just had
even at the Copa. Tell your story about the Copa.
that was May 5th, 1991. That's why you have to go to the. It got to the point. That's why I said, Fred, the hard part is going to put a handle on the years that we're talking
Nick
about.
Navarro in the Copa.
We only have 2 hours.
Some of the things you're mentioning, Norm, for instance,
I don't remember them anymore.
No, but you know you were there. We all know you were there. But some of the things you're mentioning are some of the events that really, in addition to AIDS, got the everyday average Joe and Jane, to start thinking about, I'm not going to live this way anymore.
That's what I'm saying. Those events, adversity, excited people like you and David and the average quiet citizen to say, hell no, I'm not taking it anymore, like that Peter Finch guy in the movie Network in 1976. What was his line? Somebody out there might, I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore. And in 1991, the Copa had a nightclub in Key West on Duval Street. It had a nightclub in Dania Beach on Federal Highway. Lots of you don't know this, but one of the most respected realtors in town, John Castelli, was the owner and proprietor with his husband, William Bastianson. And every year they'd close the club and renovate it, and it was the home for that place where you could be who you are, assert yourself, go out, dance, be gay, open till 4 in the morning. And I can't tell you how many closeted people used to come there because they were still hidden, and this was their place to be who they are. And Sheriff Nick Navarro, a grandstanding man who would walk barefoot on hot coals if it got him on page 1 of the paper, decided after holding a rally for, believe it or not, as crazy as this sounds, a Russian ambassador at the Sheraton Hotel, flew as part of an undercover operation in a helicopter to the Copa, arranged with Channel 7 to go after this club, which they said was awash in cocaine. And they paraded at 1 in the morning after detaining the entire population of the Copa, putting them up against the wall, having them empty their pockets, having them turn over their IDs, paraded them out with their hands over their head, one by one, to a waiting television camera, and made 5 arrests for undercover buys they had previously made from bartenders or people they could have arrested before the club ever opened. Like Dean said, I don't have 2 hours to go into it. But we were mad as hell and we weren't going to take it anymore. And John Costelli, bless his heart, hired me to represent him and the citizens, and we sued the sheriff, and Nick Navarro fought it intensely. But a funny thing happened in 1992, an election. And Nick Navarro lost the Republican primary in the election, and a very friendly gay supporter, Fort Lauderdale police chief, ran for sheriff. Unfortunately, Ron Cochran has since passed away from brain cancer, but he got elected. And on his first or second day in office, we used to have breakfast at the Floridian every morning, and there's still pictures of us there. He invited me in, he said, we're settling this lawsuit, what do you want? I said, I want a $25,000 donation to AIDS Center 1. And ironically, it was in 1984, 7 years before that, that 7 people, like Alan Turl and Gary Steinsmith and Tom, what was Tom's last name? Bradshaw, met at the bottom of the Marlin Beach Hotel to form the first group to fight AIDS in Broward County. They formed AIDS Center 1.
It was called Aid Center 1.
Aid
They
Center.
wouldn't even use the word AIDS.
Thank you, there's a good
because
point.
that even showed how closeted we were back then. And you mentioned those names, and those are the people that were our predecessors. Those are the people that came before us who started the equal rights movement from a political perspective. And unfortunately, all of them have passed away from HIV, except Jamie.
Let's not forget Alan Curtis, who was the first gay liaison to Ron Cochran, to the sheriff's office. Alan Curtis.
Alan Curtis, and then we also had,
But Alan Curtis is an example of somebody talking about asserting yourself, like you said, Denise. Alan Curtis used to take out an ad every single week in the Hot Spots magazine, and then in my paper, Express Day News. He was a salesman at a dealership on Federal Highway, and every week he would sell a car to another gay man, and every week he would have a picture of himself shaking the hand of another gay man. He says, contributing to the business community of Fort Lauderdale, purchasing a vehicle.
Let me just say about the thing about Alan Curtis was that he, not only he was out, but he used his money he would donate to all of the politicians were straight. He would donate to the straight politicians, and they involved him in their campaigns.
He was also a liaison with Jack Latona. When Jack Latona was a city commissioner.
Absolutely.
He was the gay liaison.
He was in there with Kerry Keno, and so he, honestly, from my point of view, for me, he was my introduction to gay politics in Broward County. He took me under his wing. He introduced me to the Jim Kane, who was, and still is, a big lobbyist, and Roy Parrish was commissioner, and he moved me into position to be able to do things like go and debate gay marriage on CNN, Good Morning America, in 1996. That was something, debating Peter LaBarbera, who was still making a living hating our guts, but we're winning. So I just always want to bring up Alan Curtis, because he was pivotal, and he's an unsung hero because he was not the kind of guy to stand out in front. He was the one in the back making the plans and the moves and picking the players, and I'm grateful for it.
Right.
He set up numerous meetings with Sheriff Cochran, with GUARD. He opened the doors.
What is GUARD?
Yes, tell
Yes.
us
What is
about
GUARD?
GUARD.
Tell us what GUARD is.
GUARD is, was the
Gays United
Gays United to attack
against
No, Gays
Attack.
United against.
repression and
repression,
discrimination.
and discrimination.
And I say that importantly tonight because
Yes.
one of the founders of GUARD, is it fair to say Charlie Beto was one of the early?
Yeah.
He just went in for surgery yesterday. He fell out of his wheelchair again. He's been disabled for a number of years. So.
The other founder, Dennis Delia, he called
Dennis
it Gays
Delia.
United to attack Yes, so that's what I ascribe to, attack, and we
Right.
did attack.
When I
We were
moved here,
aggressive.
Guard was the thing.
Yeah.
There was a lot of internecine, if that's how you say that word,
Internecine,
fighting
yeah,
in the gay community. The Guard was fighting with the Dolphins, everybody was arguing. I kind of stood back for about 9 months and said, well, I don't know what's going on here, but Guard was impressive. They would throw a demonstration, hundreds would show up.
Thousands.
It was
Yeah.
really cool.
Thousands
I
would
was
show
coming
up.
from LA, so if I thought it was cool, it was really cool.
And the coolest thing about it was the mixture of organizations
Everybody
and
came.
people from the different walks of life, gay or straight, that participated in the organizations. We had built such a coalition with the Dolphins, Log Cabin, P-Flag, Glisten, all of, Broward Teachers
But
Union.
all these
We were
things
so
didn't exist in the 80s.
Everybody coalesced under
None of
Guard.
Yeah,
the-
at one
the
point-
Tuesday night group existed in the 80s, did it not?
You helped create all those things. When David's talking about the Tuesday night group, he's going back to
Ancient
times when I can remember, because it was late 70s when
It was a very polite group.
Very polite
it's
group.
7 or 8
Tuesday
people
Yeah.
meeting at Joseph Campanella's condo on A1A, and
Well,
they
who
would talk
changed
about.
his name in the Tuesday night group so he wouldn't be known by his real
Well,
name.
that's-
Well, you're doing it for him now. But,
Sorry, Joe.
That's true. It was the whole Broward County Human Rights Coalition in 1978 to 80. Were 8 people
United
sitting in
Citizens for Human Rights.
we're 8 to 10 people sitting in a condo on A1A on a Tuesday night.
Well, they did open it up, and they did move to a larger venue, and they did invite people, but it was still closeted people that would show up and listen to a very polite discussion, whatever it was, and then leave and go back into their closets. But it was the beginning, I mean, it was part of the beginning. The Guard was probably, Denise, you were involved very heavily with Guard, but, because we would show up for demonstrations, you would put it out there that there'd be a demonstration in front of, what is it, Carl Ridge Presbyterian.
Right.
And
Right.
thousands of people showed up with homemade signs carrying American flags, demonstrating in front of Carl Ridge because of the minister they
When they had
had.
their prayer breakfasts or where those prayer conventions they'd have.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Reclaiming America
Yeah,
for
reclaiming-
Christ
yeah.
at the convention
Yes,
center.
and we would, yes.
We just can't say, I did radio long enough, you gotta make it clear. There were conventions that the Coral Ridge Community Church held that were called Reclaiming America for Christ. They held them at the 17th Street at the Broward County Convention Center. There were protests organized by Guard at that convention center. Dennis Delia would show up with a microphone, speak. Other community leaders would speak. We'd make headway if we could get a straight politician to come there. The same as would happen when there were protests at Coral Ridge against Reverend Kennedy, who in one of his better moments invited a couple of gay leaders to speak at his church on a Sunday and debate him.
Well, the beauty of what happened with Guard, I mean, what I saw, because I didn't really get involved until '93. And at that point, Guard was in the height of his, having his demonstrations, but the Dolphins were just neophytes. We just were a bunch of idiots sitting around going, gosh, what should we do now? Well, it just so happened.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily
We
characterize
were.
us.
Well, they were
No,
a
we were
Democratic
doing-
club, they were not an activist club.
They were a Democratic
When we
club.
just began, within a couple of months, we were doing it.
We were off and
Why wouldn't you
running.
let me talk for a second? I'll tell you what happened. Is that, the Dolphins started back up with you and me and Sue Messenger and I think Tony Espaya and
Yes.
Others.
others.
Dean
And,
was on board.
well, at the same time, Dean and Alan Terrell were talking about, Alan Terrell had worked with Broward County for years as an attorney, so he understood how it worked from the inside, how you changed ordinances. So he had taken Dean under his wing and was teaching him how to be an activist, in my opinion, how I saw it.
Oh, that's exactly what happened.
And they were planning on amending seeking to have the human rights ordinance amended concurrently. Denise was on the Human Rights Board and she was ready to stand down. So we had met at Broward Women Network, a big lesbian organization, and she said to me, why don't you do it? And she took me under her wing and I did it. And then I met Alan Curtis, introduced me to Sue Gunsberger, and Sue Gunsberger said, you will be my delegate to bring the amendment to the human rights, the Broward County Human Rights Ordinance to add sexual orientation as a protected class. And then I hooked up with you and Alan, and because we were all Dolphins, then the Dolphins, we were all kind of working on it together. It was in the beginning, me and Alan
it was a little
and Dean, because
disjointed.
we had to go to about 10 dozen meetings with the commissioners.
We had,
Well, we need to back up just a
Yeah.
minute, because we first of all, we went to the community and asked the community if they wanted to go forward with
well, that was
Not
because.
first of all,
no,
that was like
This is
third of all.
before you came to town, because in
But we
19.
did have those community meetings.
No, he's saying something else.
With me.
In 1990, the status of the law was that in order to change the county human rights ordinance, it had to be by referendum. And that's when we had the referendum in 1990. And that's kind of when I got involved, when Alan Turl met me, and Gary Steinsmith, and Brad Buckman, and all the people you mentioned earlier. And they
Can I
had.
stop you for a second? Can you put that in a little more context? Because this is kind of the start of the human rights ordinance
Right.
story.
Okay.
And it's really important that I think this story gets laid out so everybody who doesn't know about it really understands
Okay.
how it came about.
Okay, so,
So basically, you're gonna be talking now about basically how the Human Rights Ordinance emerged in the 1990s. You'll focus more on that and kind of events and people who were involved in it.
So at that time, I started becoming a little bit more aware of what's going on in our community. I was leaving my hedonistic past, and for the moment, and I started hearing, someone had said to me, you need to contact Alan Turl. He's the one that is involved in getting this referendum forward. So I contacted Alan, and then he introduced me to Brad Buckman, Gary Steinsmith, Jamie Bloodworth, and her partner,
Bev
Cawthorn, and Mr. Bradshaw. What was his first name again? Alan.
Tom Bradshaw.
Tom Bradshaw. So they were a collective group, all arguing with each other, all at each other's throats, but there was a lot of energy there. They all had the same mission in mind, and God bless their souls, they moved this thing forward.
Can I articulate one thing?
Yeah.
Because I think it speaks to what that question was. The Broward County Human Rights Ordinance, as it was, protected a certain classification, race, religion, gender, the standard.
National origin.
At that time, what were the standard protections from discrimination in the workplace, housing, and places of public accommodation? So gays did not have that protection. That's why they could go into our bars and bust us. That's why David couldn't come out in his school as a teacher being gay. So this is what they were seeking to change. And at that time, the way to change it was by referendum, but I understand that change.
So what happened was, Steve Farron, who was a state representative at the time, had a brother who passed away from HIV. And he wanted to do something in his honor. So I believe it was 1992 or 93, he was able to get the state legislature to pass a statute, a local statute, that allowed Broward County to amend its human rights ordinance by majority vote at the county commission. At that time, there was only 7 people on the county commission. And so that's what happened. And then we took up the mantle at that point. Now, instead of having to convince hundreds of thousands of people to support us, we only had to convince a majority of the county commission. And that's when the community and its disparate parts came together. And there was some rivalry going on. We had GUARD, and we had the Dolphin Democratic Club, and we had different groups, the church, the Sunshine Cathedral. I remember that they were involved to some extent. And then I remember this momentous meeting in January of 1995 at the library. We brought everybody together. And Alan Turl said it was the biggest mistake we could ever make to bring everybody together. I said, Alan, you're wrong. I said, if we all talk to one another, we'll be able to settle our differences and move forward. And it was probably the best meeting this community has had since then, because everyone was talking to each other around the table, and instead of talking behind each other.
It was a big group,
It was
too.
a big-
It was like 35, 40 people
Right,
there.
sitting
It
at
was
the table.
I want to give
But it was a
journalist-
cathartic moment. Hold on a
It was
second. It was a very
fabulous.
cathartic moment because we all got together, and the only argument that people had was how quickly we were going to get this thing done. So this was January of '95. You know, we're basically at the mercy of the county commission and the way they schedule things on their agenda. So there was one thing after another that kept causing it to be delayed, but in the end, guess when it was done? In June of 1995, Pride Month.
Right.
So we could not have asked for a better time, how it all came together in June of '95. And we had a wonderful, wonderful moment then. And was that the year that Greg Louganis was our Grand Marshal at something?
Maybe.
I think,
I
I don't
Well,
know.
By the way,
I wanted to get to
the
know.
vote was
The vote was
6 to 1. 6 to 1.
It was, and there was one holdout, we were very, very proud of our community.
And who was the holdout?
John Ross.
John Ross.
Listen,
And
Dean,
that's another whole
Okay.
story.
Yeah.
Or five.
But Robin has some very interesting stories to tell about how being accepted in our community as a lesbian, you know, keep in mind that the straight community found warming up to women who were gay much more palatable than warming up to
Yes.
men who were gay. And we used Robin as our entree, because Robin was the friendly face that everyone could love, and so
I was.
right, and it was so we at least we had our foot in the door through Robin, because she was able to be friends with all these old timers from way back when, and people who had names, their streets named after them, and who were the founding fathers, so to speak, of Fort Lauderdale. So that's how we got some of the straight community to finally back our cause.
It was
Go on,
crazy.
go on. Yeah, okay, well,
when Dean touched earlier upon the fact that there were disagreements amongst the leadership in the gay community, he touched upon something that has to be expanded upon. Because I stayed apart from politics. I was more a journalist, a columnist writing about these issues in Hotspots and Scoop magazine, in the weekly news. I was their lawyer. I eventually started in 1998 the Express Gay News. And one of the things that I learned, and I still follow it to the T today at South Florida Gay News, is you have to write about the wins of the community, but you have to write about the warts and the wounds too. This group amongst us that were fighting for civil rights, we were not perfect, not pristine. We were, as Dean said, occasionally disagreeable and disjointed. If the history is going to be recorded accurately, there were bitter, angry fights amongst ourselves. Some of them linger today. One thing Robin Bodiford said.
Go, Robin.
You're next, Robin. Robin, you're next. You're next.
One thing Robin Bodiford said about Shane Gunderson recently was very hurtful to him. We fought for a common cause and a certain goal, but make it clear, whether it's San Francisco, San Diego, New York, and Stonewall, or South Florida, we fought. There was divisions and disagreements amongst ourselves, and there was turmoil in our organization. I got involved once in these things with something called the United Citizens for Human Rights. You and I became co-chair with 2 women, and 6 months later, everybody was fighting. You wouldn't want to go to these meetings because gay people were fighting for civil rights, but we were uncivil to each other. So
We had a lot of energy, Norm.
but if you're going to be an honest journalist, the truth is, within our family, we had feuds, and that inhibited us, it inspired us.
Okay, Robin, You raise your
Well,
hand.
I don't even know where to go with this now.
Okay.
Because I
Go with
was
the
going
flow.
to, I was wanting to respond to where Dean was talking about the story of how we actually got gay rights here, which I think is full of a lot of interesting stories. And yes, there was a lot of ugliness in
Thank you.
this
That's what-
community.
and-
And that's true.
that's the
And
truth.
thank you for saying it, so I don't have to be the one to bring it up. So I don't even know if I want to go down that path,
But-
but
let
that
me
isn't
tell
the
you.
story that I was gonna tell.
But you know what?
We have so many other good
No,
stories
there
to
is
tell.
but you have to,
Wait,
you have to tell the
wait.
difference between GUARD and the Dolphins.
But-
GUARD was an activist organization, and they were in the streets, and they wanted to move forward. Dolphins were a political organization, and they wanted to work within the system, and they fought because one didn't like the other's approach. When we got together finally, when we did the human rights ordinance, and we all came together to make sure this was passed, the fighting stopped. We had different approaches, but we all had the same goal,
Well,
which was ultimately the same goal.
Ultimately, what happened was Americans for Equality was formed.
Yes.
Americans for Equality was primarily the Dolphin Board.
Yes, it was.
And GUARD was like the community organization arm of that. They were the ones who, we all brought people out, but they had our history and the connections and the know-how to bring out those masses of people. The day that we went before the Broward Commission, or the 2 days we had to go, well, how many people were there? Like
Well,
5,
fill
6,
the
7?
entire chamber.
And over, and
500,
we had
whatever it was.
speakers in the
It was hours,
halls.
yeah,
hours and hours. I think it was like 5
It was
hours.
unbelievable, the numbers that we turned out, and we as the Dolphins and Americans for Equality, which was just maybe like 7 or 8 people, could have never done that without GUARD.
Without GUARD.
But GUARD itself really wasn't very friendly to us, because Dennis was
The personalities
was
of
a
the two
character.
presidents.
Dennis was a
Hold on.
different kind of a guy.
Dennis and Brad
Dennis-
did
But this is not, hold on, I don't
Dennis
argue
was
with
more,
you.
no, Dennis was more than a
But
character.
let's start.
We have to tell the truth. You get together in these
We're telling the truth.
retrospectives, it's like everybody's sitting together,
Okay.
drinking wine and cheese and saying, oh, weren't these old days great?
Let's-
Dennis became a drug addict. Dennis
Oh.
became a cocaine user.
Oh, we don't
Dennis,
have to
no,
go
no.
down that
Dennis became a
path.
symbol of what people in the community did not pay enough attention to, which was cocaine abuse and meth abuse and
Right.
alcohol
I
abuse
wanna say
amongst the
that
gay community,
I would like to stop
which we
talking
had
about
to
that.
deal. No,
Yes.
this is the
Yes.
reality.
No, I'm talking about the reality.
Okay, wait.
That's
Okay.
quite an allegation.
That's
Hey,
enough.
wait,
That's
hold on.
enough.
Can
It's
I
enough.
intervene? Can I intervene?
Fred, you have a question?
I want to intervene. I think you can say that about any community, okay? About the African American community, the community up in Boca, which I know, and so I think you're right. I think that there are, that there are people who have these kinds of things. On the other hand, I think all of them have contributed in a way that we have to remember.
It was our dialectic.
And so this is-
It was how we
Oh,
rose,
yes, on the
it
sub-
was how we rose, just like you saw in the movie, how they all
How
fought
we
with each
rose.
other.
Yeah.
It was the same
How
exact.
you said that about me being like the
entree, yeah.
Trojan horse.
Yeah.
I wasn't the entree, that really sounds weird.
Fred,
May I speak?
Let Robin finish.
I just want to respond to
Okay,
That
was
okay.
water I put in this, right?
that. Hold
Just
on.
checking.
All right, Norm.
I
what?
Fred, Dennis healed. Dennis was hurt, he healed, he got better, he overcame, as many of us have.
Yeah.
I was just saying that if
You
you're
already
gonna
said it.
tell the history of the community, you have to expose the hurt and the harm as well as the healing and the helping.
Okay.
You can't ignore it, that's my point.
No, that's true, and I think also the point is that, one of the things I was looking at in terms of these sheets, I ran across the name of Wayne Besson and the organization of Sons and Daughters of America. And that's, I think, a very good example of the kind of conflicts and emergencies. Wayne Besson at that time was a young graduate of the University of Florida, where he was an out and gay activist on campus. And he came down here and he decided that he was going to create this kind of young, as compared to these people, this young
We were all
activist.
young back then.
This young activist group, and he wanted to appeal to younger people. So, since I was teaching at the time, I got connected with him, and he said, well, I'm gonna print up this leaflet. So I printed up a leaflet, and he said, and the leaflet basically said, who do you want to represent us? And then he had a picture of all these guys in leather marching. Then he had another picture of, must have been a frat house at the University of Florida. And it was something that was really it created something of a scandal, because basically is that the leather community in Fort Lauderdale is very large. And to basically diss them like that would be saying we don't want the people to like define us by them. I think it's sort of
So where are you going with this?
Well, where I'm going with this is that the kind of tensions that happened. You talk about the hedonistic period. Okay, in that hedonistic period, there was a lot of things that came out, a lot of things that were established. What was that group? NAMBLA. Okay. Now, how many remember NAMBLA?
We have to talk
Yeah.
about
Okay.
Well, thanks for bringing that up.
I'm talking about the equal rights.
Well,
movement.
okay, no, but
Those groups had national, there were national groups which may or may not have had a scant of representation locally.
Okay,
And
they
they
did.
weren't
They
part
did.
of our story.
No, they're not part of your story. But the point is that the leather community was, and
The leather
it-
community
really.
existed
Not
back then.
really.
Not here.
Not the measure that you might see
They weren't
today.
politically involved, they weren't involved
they
with
were
us.
involved. In terms of the AIDS campaign, the leather community here, I think, played a very significant part. Because basically, it was the notion is that those people in the leather community were the ones that were probably hit the hardest as a group. They were the ones who, I think, in the leather community, who basically were out in a way that many people who other lesbian and gays weren't.
Well, okay, so let me follow up on that.
Okay.
So there were certain bars back then, one called Tacky's.
Yes.
Okay, which was a leather bar, okay? And I would say more deaths emanated from those patrons than most other places that I've
It's
seen.
tragic.
It was very tragic. I remember doing many deathbed wills at that time, and
Okay.
people were dying within 2 weeks of being diagnosed. It was a very, very tragic time. So to that extent, the leather community was definitely impacted significantly.
Well, at this point, I have to just jump in and say
Tell us.
this, since we're putting all this nasty stuff on the table, even being drug addicts and sex addicts and getting
Never on
arrested in
here.
bars. So I didn't know if I was gonna bring this up, but I am now, because it was a big deal to me, and honestly, when I look back on the years from back 93 to 2007, I'm bitter. Okay, the triumphs
Why
were
is that?
wonderful, but it made the betrayals all the more bitter. When I moved here in 93, this community had never heard of gender parity. Women were discriminated against, women were not included, and it took from 93 to 2003 to get the Dolphin Democratic Club to establish gender parity. In the 90s, I had been the vice president of the Dolphins overall, I believe, for 7 terms. I'm not exactly sure. It seemed like forever. At one point, and I was always actively recruiting women, encouraged to recruit women, and bringing them in, and I was hopelessly naive and idealistic. And at a certain point, we had Denise, who's now, what are you, city manager? What is it you do?
Public Works Director.
She's really smart. And we had Cindy Day was a financial planner for Janet Reno, was among her clients. Delia Lowe was the executive director of the new Gay and Lesbian Community Center, which is now Equality and Pride Center. Melissa Foytek, an entrepreneur, a very successful real estate entrepreneur. Who am I leaving out?
Cindy Day.
I said Cindy Day. All right, there were 5 of us, and we were all on the board, and we wanted
That's
gender
more than
parity.
5, by the way, but go ahead.
Whatever, we had a number of women. I can't remember, the one gal in particular, I can't remember her name. But we were all on the board, and at that point,
Jacqueline Warner eventually came.
after we had amended the Broward County Human Rights Ordinance to include sexual orientation, the community was on fire. We had maybe, I don't know, am I exaggerating, 200 members of the Dolphin Democratic
They
Club?
show up at every meeting,
So,
yeah.
and they'd show up
Once a
at
month.
every meeting,
Once a month.
and we had.
Did you used to call us every
And-
Sunday night and
I
say,
would
you better
call-
show
And
up?
we
I
would
would.
meet at this hotel down on 17th Street Causeway, and it was spectacular. We wanted gender parity. All we wanted is to write into the bylaws the same thing that every other Democratic club in the state of Florida had, that you would have a president and vice president of opposite genders. That kind of gender parity policy had been going on nationwide for a number of years, since the 70s, when it was universally accepted that women were being discriminated against, and so that we're going to make a place at the table for women and have gender parity. Well, I'm here to tell you, Denise's tires were flattened. We were insulted, we were assaulted, we were physically assaulted, Mr. Stack. We had big problems, and as a
remember what
result,
you
the
were talking
Dolphins, I can tell you exactly, the Dolphins just about went out of business, because in a big meeting, I stood up when she's being maligned
Well,
on the
before you go
stage.
there-
Michael
before you go there, we had-
every
Team
man
Robin
in
deserves
the
a
club,
chance to have her say.
every,
Be patient
you
with
wanna
everybody
hear the
else.
dirt, every man in the board stood up and made a speech against women being involved, said that if we had gender parity, unqualified women would serve. Every woman that was serving on that board was at least as qualified as every man, if not far more qualified. I stood up in that meeting because I was no longer on the board. I had quit so Denise could take my place, and I stood up in the audience and I said, I resign. Half of the room cheered, half of the room booed, and after that, 9 out of 10 Dolphins quit. They made fun of us in the paper. It was a travesty. So that is a story of a fight that we had.
Well, I wasn't president of the Dolphins at the
No,
time,
you
so
were
please-
present in
So
a
please
subcommittee
understand.
meeting where you were
Yes.
so overwhelmingly verbally assaulting that I brought a tape recorder,
recorder. I unplugged
hoping that you,
I unplugged the
knowing
tape
that,
recorder.
no,
I
you
did.
snatched it out of the wall.
Okay, hold on, oh, wait.
You wanna talk about?
No, I mean.
You didn't interrupt him saying that, so-and-so was an
We
ass
want
at
this to
it.
basically be a historical record.
Well, this
It
is
is.
important, but let me just say this, Robin.
It happened.
Everything you said, I don't know some of those details, but I do know that.
Ask Ray right out.
No, let me finish.
You're calling me,
Let
you're
me-
saying
let
I'm
me-
not telling the truth?
No, I didn't say that. I'm just saying I don't know all
You
those
said you
details.
don't know if those events happened.
Okay, so I really need to speak without being interrupted.
I'm gonna let you speak, but I'm just gonna say, don't tell me that if I
Okay.
say an event
All right,
happened, it
all right.
happened.
I'm not saying.
I have to intervene here, I'm sorry.
I'm not
Okay, no,
disagreeing.
Dean, say something, you got 30 seconds.
Okay, so I just want to preface a little bit what Robin said, because I was the chair of the committee on bylaw changes. And I remember we met on a regular basis, and I remember, Denise, you were there, and we came out with a report asking for gender parity between male and female in the leadership. That was the report we came out with.
What year was that?
Let me, Robin, finish.
What year?
This was all the time that you're talking about right now.
All right, you got 15 seconds.
Okay, so we brought it to the meeting. We were having the meeting at the Embassy Suites. I remember the night. And we were all ready to present the proposal. We expected to be voted on that night so that there would be gender parity. And one fellow, who happened to be Shane Gunderson, called, no, excuse me, it was Ron Gunsberger. Ron Gunsberger said, I call a quorum. Well, back then, quorum requirements were extremely high. We had, Robin said, about 200 members, so we had to have a significantly high number of people there that night. Even though there were quite a few people there, we were short a quorum by 3 or 4 people. So the recommendation from the committee never got approved or accepted, and that's when everything.
Okay, I would like to move on now, because basically this is an issue I think that we can argue amongst ourselves.
I
Please.
do
You
think
see,
that
to me, there was a
I do
consensus
think
that we were gonna tell the
I
whole
would
story.
like to
Wait.
say something. I mean, I've been accused of things here. when I joined the Dolphin Democrats, there was one female on the board, and it was all white men. So I need to talk about this, because I think it's important. And I was a member of the Dolphin board. I was not in an officer position. When there was some deaths, several deaths in the board, and I was, Sue Messenger became president of the Dolphins. And I think it's important that we didn't have a vice president. So I asked her, we were a small organization, 15 people would show up, if on a good night. And I said, well, let me be your vice president, because I'd been her communication director where I'd written the newsletter. And she said, fine. So the club voted me in. Sue, when Robin and I were on the board, and we were talking about moving forward with this human rights ordinance that you're talking about, the Dolphin Club voted overwhelmingly, I think 15-1, to move forward with it. And Sue Messenger resigned that night because she was in a teaching position where she couldn't, so I want to make sure this is understood. I became president simply because the bylaw says when the president resigns, the vice president automatically becomes president. So I become president of the Dolphins. I'm elected, that was in December. In January, we had an election, and I was elected president. I went to it's still all white male board, except for Rob, male, except one female Robin.
That other gal.
I don't remember, but I really need to go on here.
Well, no, wait.
But
Wait, this is not
Well,
about
we ended
Dolphin,
up-
this is not about Dolphin Club
But I've been
politics.
accused of something here that
Well, I mean, I think you said
But
something.
when I became president, we ended up, when I resigned when my term was up 2 years later, when I was voted out actually because Gary Steinsmith came in, we had a diverse board. We had women on the board, we had minorities on the board, and we had white, so I think it was a diverse
We
board.
had women on the board.
Women on the board.
Yes, we certainly
Guys,
did.
let me just say one thing.
So
I'm watching
I don't
people
think that I
leave
should
the
be-
room, just like they did when this crap would go on.
Okay.
And I'm
Okay.
seeing people
Right.
leave.
Move on, let's move on. Okay, move on. All right, Norm, are you going to talk about this or something
No,
else?
tell us a good story.
Tell us a good
Really great
story.
story.
Look, guys, everybody.
Let's get back to the timeline of history
Okay.
in Broward County, because that's really kind of what we're here
Okay, so
to
moving
do.
forward to 1999, Robin called me, and she said, Dean.
Wait, start again.
That's not what happened, but go ahead.
Well, how did it happen? Tell us. I remember that we got together.
What happened was, at the end of the campaign for Americans for Equality,
Yeah.
we had formed this group, Americans for Equality,
Right.
to fight the effort to repeal the human rights ordinance as it pertained to sexual orientation. At the end of that campaign, there was some talk about doing a domestic partnership ordinance, but that kind of like drifted. In '97, I got the materials from Tom Coleman in LA, and I brought that to the Dolphins, and then you said you would do it with me, and then we went forward, and in '99
Because I remember we sat in your office.
we did end up having to go back there.
We went back, we sat in your office on Broward Boulevard, and we said, let's put this together. We're trying to use the Hawaii concept, because Hawaii was the first one to talk about this. And they use this concept of reciprocal beneficiaries. Remember
But we
that?
ended up going with the language from Los Angeles
Yes,
County.
we ended up doing that. And then we connected with the county attorney's office, who then integrated it into the county.
And Jamie Bloodworth taught us how to do find and replace.
I love Jamie Bloodworth. And then that was ultimately passed, and by that time, the county commission was 9 members, and it was an 8-1 vote. And who was the one that didn't vote for it?
Roscoe.
Okay. And so it had almost unanimously passed the county commission in 1999, again in June. And we were the first in the entire state to have a county government pass domestic partnership ordinance like it was. And it was then taken to the US Supreme Court by, what was the name of the organization that took the county to court? The county defended it vigorously. The judge that wrote the opinion.
In the state Supreme Court.
The state Supreme Court. The judge that wrote the opinion in Broward County had a gay son. And so he wrote he wrote the opinion in such a way, and I remember his telling us that, don't worry, this will pass the Supreme Court muster. And it did, and even though there's a statute on the books today saying you cannot have, well, now we have marriage, so it doesn't make any difference. But there's still a statute, right, Norm, that you're not allowed to have any kind of relationship that's recognized in law that resembles a marriage. It can't be domestic partnership, whatever. But our ordinance survived the state Supreme Court, and now, of course, we have marriage equality in the United States. So that's how we dealt with
That's a
marriage
happy
equality.
ending. Maybe we
That
should
was
just
a happy
stop
ending.
there.
But then other issues came up. For example, you talk about the Democratic Convention you went to. I went to the Democratic Convention in the year 2000. When I got back, we had this big hoopla about the Boy Scouts denying young boys who identified as gay from being allowed to participate in Scout programs and groups. And there was a big controversy in Fort Lauderdale because we had typically assisted the local Boy Scout organization with money to carry them through the year. So we had a huge issue here in Fort Lauderdale. There was a big public demonstration. The chamber was filled. There were kids and parents and signs and saying we were going to hell and we were demons, and it was the most offensive thing. But the city of Fort Lauderdale eventually, I think it was 3-2 or 4-1 vote, denied the Boy Scouts their right to the $10,000 allocation. And that was another milestone in our community because it was very bitter, and remember that?
That was a
awful.
huge deal.
It was
Huge,
awful.
huge.
So as each year went on, then in 2002, this kid named Dean Trentala said, you know what? It's time again to get one of us a seat at the table. And that's when I made the decision about the city commission.
Okay, Dave, thank you.
Take it from there, Robin.
The important thing that I was trying to convey as a journalist, and I guess it got proven by the discussion that we just had, is our growth as a community was neither pristine nor perfect. We had difficulties, but like a family, we overcame them. We had issues like families with drug abuse, with divorce, with addiction. I wasn't trying to single out any one person or individual because we've each had complications from illnesses and addictions in our own family. But what we learned in the early 80s with HIV and AIDS is we can only count on ourselves to overcome our shortcomings. We can't look to other people. We did that in many respects with the HIV crisis by rising to the occasion and forming organizations and insisting that there be funding for illnesses and expanding things like the Ryan White program. Denise just said it so best. It's not about an individual, it's about what we have done collectively as a group. We saw crisis and overcame it. And that's why the Broward United Against Discrimination was able to go forward. It's not about individual disputes that the Dolphin Democrats may have had with each other. It's not about insulting David or criticizing Robin. It's about, despite having that in our own lives, politically or personally, we persevered, we achieved. We would not stand to be prosecuted. We would not stand to be persecuted. And we had people grow up. And when I started the Express Gay News in 1999, I saw that South Florida was becoming the same-sex-centric community that the whole nation was looking at. And we weren't showcasing the Melanie Moorhead's, Robin's old partner, who was a doctor. We weren't showcasing the individuals that were gay and lesbian and opening up realty firms and starting doctors' clinics. And like Gary Richmond 30 years as an advocate, an internist and pulmonologist for HIV. We were able to suddenly illuminate your lives, what you accomplished as individuals. And South Florida Gay News is able to do that now still. But the reality, as I try to point out, is you can't ignore the warts and the wounds. So when the president of Pride South Florida stole $48,000 from our budget, I had to put him on the front page as a thief. Not because I wanted to demean or denigrate the gay community, but that's the reality of our lives. When Joel Steiner, who helped underwrite my paper, the Express Gay News, by giving me $1,000 a week in advertising for mutual benefits, turned out to be running one of the worst financial scams in the country, worth billions of dollars.
Okay, no.
I'm done. And Steve Steiner.
Okay.
You have to be able to say that he went to jail for 25 years.
No, okay, thank you.
I am done.
Okay, good. All right, I'm gonna move on. Okay, now you're talking about the 1990s. We have the domestic partnership. We have the ordinance in place. On the other hand, South Florida here is in South Florida, and we're in the state of Florida, where you go past the Palm Beach County line north, or you go past the Broward line west, you're like in a different environment. Now, what kind, how are we going to sort of deal with that situation that we, on the one hand, are very gay friendly down here in South Florida. On the other hand, we are living in a larger environment run by a state government that can really affect our lives in very negative ways.
Well, for me, the way what I did, which once we had enacted all the legislation that we could locally, there was the issue of gay adoption, which that involved either it was a twofold approach. One, we had to bring the right cases to court, and we repeatedly were disappointed. I remember I don't remember that Judge Lynch, we thought he was gay friendly. I don't remember the whole detail of it, but it wasn't so friendly, and we didn't get it. And so it was going to court, and it was educating the public. I personally was involved quite a bit with that. And speaking of the bar,
You're talking about the adoption?
I wrote a letter, yes, to the Florida Bar regarding the Florida Bar possibly, endorsing gay adoption. And I don't think they did it for revenge. They took my letter and they put it on Amazon so that it was like published, so that people could like buy it for $1.86 or something. I thought it was the most bizarre thing. Yes, for years. Yeah, I used to have a link to it from my website because it was so
Is it still
cool.
available?
It was a great, because I had given a speech at the Tower Club, which was fabulous. It was a debate kind of thing with that Anthony Verdugo, that moron. So I mean, it wasn't that hard to be fabulous. But I was fabulous. But anyway, that's where that letter came from, the speech. But that was just funny. But so that was another struggle.
Well, that was another struggle, which the Grace Foundation.
And ultimately,
the Grace Foundation
we
funded the attorney position with the American Civil Liberties Union down in Miami-Dade, and which brought the case before the court and to the appellate level, which ultimately allowed gay adoption to be made legal here.
that was a long struggle.
It was a long struggle. It took several years, but I applaud the ACLU for taking it upon itself to make this happen, and it was another milestone. So as Robin said, every couple of years there's another thing that we try to confront, and the challenge in our community, and whether it be discrimination at the workplace or at home, whether it be domestic partnership, whether it be the Boy Scouts, adoption. So we seek out the new challenges that help break down those barriers that we have always just assumed would never go away. And then we have marriage equality, which none of us would ever have thought that we would have been able to accomplish in our lifetime. And look at how many spouses are sitting here in the audience They're the only ones still sitting here because the other ones are dead. And they have to sit here. And these are the new milestones. So being part, talking about, running for public office, we have a lot of LGBT people in public office now in South Florida, the majority in Wilton Manors, I think even the majority in Oakland Park, and hopefully we're gonna have 2 people on the Fort Lauderdale City Commission who are going to be in the LGBT community, which is extremely important, a great milestone. So, Robin hit it right on the head. These are every few years, we try to find a new challenge that we can try to overcome.
Well, I know this isn't supposed to be a Dean Trentalis pep rally, but considering all the years we suffered under Noggle, and then his successor is tremendously better, it will be so amazing to have you as the mayor of Fort Lauderdale.
All right, okay. What do you, one of the things you mentioned about gay marriage, and that was a real game changer in the sense that, and then beyond that was the portrayal of LGBT people and issues in the media. That is, for somebody to get thrown off a network or to be fined because they said something homophobic. 10 years ago, that wouldn't have happened. And the whole idea now is that it seems as if both the media culture and also the legal culture has been, being a lot more accepting. On the other hand, does that mean people's minds have changed? Are people, straight people, like people who have previously been homophobic, the thing that they've learned from this is not that we have to be accepting of LGBT people, is that we gotta keep our mouths shut about being homophobic.
Well, I see where you're going with this. I think under the Obama administration, we saw a tremendous pushing the envelope of the sensitivity that we thought America was finally achieving towards individual rights and minority groups. Unfortunately, with the election of Donald Trump, we see a pushback to the politically correct, as they call it, notions of how to work with minorities. So I think the pendulum's kind of swung back a little bit. What do you folks think?
I want to say that it's always been the issue that legislation, I can't think of the right word, but you can't legislate necessarily morality. However, when the laws change, eventually the people will come around. We are in the middle of a backlash right now, unfortunately. In my shreds of idealism that are left, believe that it's going to pass. But I think you can, to a point, legislate morality. People learn that it's, they may still feel uncomfortable because you're gay, but what you speak, you begin to believe. And so when people learn that they can't,
Well, you once said to me, if they say the word lesbian enough times, it won't be so difficult.
Let me pick up on what you were talking about earlier when you started to bring up Wayne Beston's group, the Sons and Daughters of America. Wayne being one of my best friends, now just finished a gig as a radio talk show host in Chicago. He started that organization because he wanted to win the debate. He knew that when the media portrayed gays and lesbians, they would do a thing with dykes on bikes. They would show a
carnival-like image.
A carnival-like image of the gay community. In fact, when I started the Express Day News, you said you liked the stories. I was in the hospital at the time with cancer, and there was this situation where the Sun Sentinel decided after a gay pride rally you could probably remember more than me because I was taking chemotherapy.
Well, no, we had a gay pride rally, and they instead of showing the thousands of men and women that showed, they had a drag queen on the front of the, I think one of the nuns in perpetual whatever it was.
Indulgence.
Yes, indulgence. and the community was outraged. And the community went to the editorial board of the Sun Sentinel and said, although this young person, this person was there, it doesn't represent the overall community, and we want you to represent the community and they apologized in an editorial saying that, yes.
And one of the things they did, which was kind of cute, was that they said they're gonna bring the leaders of the gay community together. So they brought the publishers of all the gay bar guides together and the gay bar owners. And I'm sitting there in the hospital and I was saying, this does not represent the gay community anymore.
Well, they didn't know who the gay community
Right,
was.
they didn't know who to get.
That's
Because
how
we
they
did
were.
not have a paper that illuminated and showcased the lives of the lawyers, the people like Tom Green, who was serving on the Broward County Conservation District and is now a commissioner in Wilton Manors, who was part of the Tuesday night group, but didn't let anybody know it for 30 years.
We had a terrific paper in Miami, the Weekly
we knew.
News, TWN, which was around for what, 30, 40 years?
Been a long time.
So we had a terrific paper that served the Tri-County area, but the Sun Sentinel was just so out of it, they really didn't have a clue where to
It's very
start.
conservative.
They
It
have
was
come a
conservative.
long way.
A long way.
They had Marilyn Guadabasi writing editorials saying our
Yeah.
homosexuals were deviants that should be locked up in the late 1990s on their op-ed page.
But in
So-
the 90s, they allowed me to write 2 opinion pieces, basically insulting Mayor Noggle. I'm good at insulting.
So that's what Wayne
Yes,
Besson did. Wayne Besson created a group with the Sons and Daughters of America, and he got a billboard by the Copa down in Dania
Yes.
Beach to showcase gay men and women in shirts and ties with their clothes on, which is what I try to do with the paper. But it's a struggle because people did not like being labeled. But I will touch on one other issue that Denise and Robin talked upon. While we fought these external struggles, like Dean says, with the Boy Scouts, with marriage equality, there still was levels of discrimination within our own community. I'm learning as 5 years as the publisher of South Florida Gay News, how in the gay community, it was Daniel Moynihan, a senator from New York, once called it benign neglect. We had benign neglect to the transgender community for years. Until I employed a transgender graphic designer, we had very few people coming to me with transgender stories for the SFGN because we just didn't know about it. Now it's coming out what kind of, not just the promise of their lives, but the pain they endure.
And that's the next challenge for our
The
community.
next challenge, even within, has to do with gay men needing to get along better with gay women. We still haven't done that well. And one of the things I learned with ACWA, with Women in Network, there are so many amazing, talented gay women that have been treated as second-class citizens by gay men for so long. When we go to do the Out 50 every year, and we suddenly see this amazing list of people we can include, there are so many women that haven't been heralded with their accomplishments the way they should have been, because the gay community has always been dominated by men. That has to change
The
too.
gay activist community, not the gay community.
So anyway, that's all I was trying to say from the beginning. Yeah, we have to pick ourselves up and step forward from within, as well as the achievements the political people have from without. I'll give you an example. Wasn't that in the Oscars or the Emmys just the other day, a woman said, well, yesterday all the best songs were sung by everyone except the one woman that was nominated. A week before, a woman said, I'd like to nominate the 5 best directors. Notice that how nice that they invited a woman to nominate all the male directors. And you go to the Thursday morning meeting that David Jobin has for executive directors of not-for-profits and social service agencies, and the vast majority of them are gay white men, and so few women as executive directors within our own community right here in
So,
Wilton
all right,
Manors.
that brings up a good point. That brings up a good point. And Denise, maybe, and Robin, you can help us out here. over the last couple of decades, we see a dominance of white male men. I guess that's redundant. We see males kind of either asserting themselves or being in leadership roles, and many of us wonder, why are not women participating in the same groups and the same numbers?
Wow.
Talk to me about that.
I think you should talk, I'll talk, but I think Denise could speak to that. And
So why are you talking?
Yeah.
Well, ask me.
Sit back,
You
I
said
want to hear from
Robin.
No,
Denise.
but
That's what I'm
Denise
saying.
and Robin, help us out here.
We'll both share, and, you know, I'll start with, you know, just my career. You know, it's been pretty atypical, being a licensed plumber. So I've worked in construction.
Right.
Which has been a culture shock, more for the men I've worked with than it was for me. And as I moved along in my career and was promoted and supervised men, it was a culture shock again, more for them than for me. And there was always resistance. It was just, women have typically, for most men, been their sisters, their wives, and not someone that is in a position of authority over them. And it holds true to this day. One of the wonderful things I can report is that in the city I work in Cooper City, and we now have a parity on our directors, our departmental directors. And it's very unusual.
So gender parity.
Gender parity.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's very unusual not to have.
How does that work? Like, what does that mean, gender parity? Like, of the 10 department heads, 5 have to be men, 5 have to be women?
No, we don't have anything instituted.
Okay.
It just happened that way.
Okay.
Quality women have been applying for jobs for years,
Okay.
and they continue to apply for jobs, but they're being hired more frequently now over a man or a white man. So it's just portraying itself in that little city. It's portraying itself that way, and it's a wonderful thing, and we're all enjoying it.
But so in the LGBT activist history, we see, you know, well, Robin spoke to the history of women trying to rise to the top and were kind of shoved down, you know, in those episodes of the Dolphin Democratic Club. But I mean, in other contexts, we often see, like
The example would be the Stonewall Library Board.
Okay, talk
How
about
many,
that.
well, I'm not on it. I was on it briefly and I want to say 2007, 2008. And it was like 12 old guys, 12 old white guys and me. You know, I mean, I went to art school back in the day. And so I tried to sketch everybody so I could remember their names when I first started. But they all look the same. So it didn't help too much.
But yet there are women's groups.
And why didn't I stay? Well, I had my little issues, but essentially it was just because it wasn't that much fun for me. Because it's a law of attraction, you know. I mean, go out for them afterwards at lunch with them and stuff. I mean, I like gay guys. Like 95% of my clients are gay and I love them, and I have gay male friends, but I'm just saying it's the law of attraction. And plus, some of the decisions that were being made I felt were dismissive of women, and that was irritating. And I'm at the point in my life where if I find something irritating, I won't do it. And so it's the law of attraction. I think that's part of it. It's hard to get women to come. I mean, that's why it was such a big deal to get 5 women on the board at the Dolphins.
Right. Because
the women would come there and they said, there's no women here. Why do we want to be here? I said, oh, please come. You're going to like it. It's going to be good. And then in the end, they all got stabbed in the back, so it was horrible. But that's a million years ago and whatever.
We're not bitter.
But I'm just saying, it's hard to, you know, it's just like, why don't more black people join the Stonewall Library Board? Why don't, you know, more anybody that's a minority or not be,
So in some of these organizations.
not white men.
Right, so in some of these organizations, and actually this is to Fred's point, as we're starting to see an evolving community, go back to the Dolphin Democratic Club, there's a tremendous diversity on that board. Straight, gay, young, old, happy to see a lot of young people coming into the fold because, you know, we old geezers aren't gonna be there forever, right? So the thing is that that's important for the vitality and the sustainability of our community. I do see certain organizations where women do gravitate, for example, Equality Florida. I see many women joining in the ranks of the fundraising efforts of Equality Florida. Somehow that has seized upon the attraction of women.
I think part of it is because Nadine Smith is
Is executive director,
ED,
right.
and is the face of
Of
Equality
Equality Florida, okay. And then Women in Network is starting to come back together again now. I understand it may be reforming, I don't know. But,
We'll see.
but that was never a political organization. That was really a social group. And I remember being told that I wasn't allowed to go there and to talk about some of our political efforts because I was a guy. And so, you know, it's just interesting how, you know, so Norm is pointing out how even today, we still have that separation, and I want to know, how do we overcome that? And I don't know the answer to that.
Before we move on, I want to open this up to questions from the audience. So you may finish this discussion.
Okay.
The one thing that I can remember about, you mentioned Women in Network, Robin and I spoke there after we came back from the convention in '96.
They made an exception for you.
They did make an exception.
Because you went with Rob?
That's exactly right. But I don't think a man had spoken there before, had they? And then the Fountain magazine, you and I appeared on the cover of Fountain. I was the first male to appear on it. But we were just
I opened doors for you.
Yeah, I guess you did. I opened doors for you. Anyway, we were trailblazers back then. I mean, it was fun. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, no, I mean, I was saying,
Well, as
your
far
question
as
was,
that question about how to get people involved, that's a question that we've been asking for decades.
Right.
And I don't know that any of us have the answer to that here, but we probably all have more good stories about gay politics in Broward, I know.
Okay, I'd like to open this up for questions if people have, yes.
Come on, question.
Hold on, I need you to go to the microphone.
The microphone?
Yeah.
It's right in
Which
the
is
middle of
right
the
there
room.
in the center of the room.
Oh, I see it, thank you. Hi, thanks first of all for being part of our community and the history that you brought here and lived, which is pretty exciting to hear. I have a question though. I've been watching the FX series, the Ryan Murphy thing about the Versace murders in Miami. There's an interesting subset in that thing about the police. It's 1990, it's South Florida, and there's a gay killer out, in South Florida, and the police department doesn't know what to do in the gay community because there's not out detectives. There's not really overt homophobia, but there's not an outreach to the gay community, so there's this big wall between the gay community and the police department. And it's kind of what made, the thing linger as long as it did. And I just thought that was an interesting subset, like how did South Florida, how did Fort Lauderdale merge and bridge some kind of outreach between the police department and the gay community?
I'd like that.
Well,
Ron Cochran.
Ron Cochran.
When Ron Cochran was elected after Nick Navarro got defeated in the Republican primary, Ron Cochran was the sheriff of Broward County, and he opened up the sheriff to dialogue, to talking. He even came to the Dolphin board and swore us in as officers of the Dolphin Democratic
he
Club.
was very wonderful and respectful.
Wonderful man.
Appointed a
And
gay
it was Ron
liaison.
Cochran, but that was in 1992 when he got elected.
And didn't he also start hiring, at that point?
Yes.
Out
lesbian and gay men to serve on the police.
to work, it was amazing.
Yes, there was Nick Navarro, who was really anti-gay, Republican, and when he got defeated in the Republican primary, Ron Cochran beat his opponent, whoever he was, I don't remember, and Ron Cochran was the one that opened it up in '92.
And as I said, the day after he got elected, because we had breakfast every morning, he loved burnt toast, dry. He came to me and said, "We're settling this lawsuit." And he said, "What would it take to settle the lawsuit?" I said, "How about making a donation back to the AIDS community?" And he did. So he was the beginning of straight politicians standing up
Yes.
for gay rights, which
Yes.
meant so much because it it gave us a legitimacy because he took a guy like, I think you said it was Alan Curtis, and made him a liaison.
Alan, one of the other things Alan Curtis did, as a liaison, he liaised with GUARD, when John Graves was involved, Dennis, myself, and Sheriff Cochran and the Fort Lauderdale Police Chief. We made great inroads with them to provide sensitivity training to every
That's
single
right.
Yes,
officer.
exactly.
That's
On
right.
BSO and every single Fort Lauderdale officer. It became mandatory. And believe me, there were some instances where we had some very, very irate students in the class, but they were forced to be there and in a way forced to better understand their interactions with the gay community and how to treat us with respect and dignity. We even had one Broward Sheriff Sergeant, Barbara Stewart, who was given permission by Sheriff Cochran, she was out, to be a part of our panel in visiting the other police agencies.
When, just to show you what happened, before then, Dean had talked about, and I think about the raids that would happen with the gay bars. The Tuesday night group invited a sheriff deputy to come talk to them. And he insulted us and called us queers. Because I remember walking out with several other people right after it happened, because he used the queer word, right in front of us. Yeah, he did. We met at the old Unitarian Universalist Church, which was downtown on 6th, I forget.
Which group?
No, the Unitarian Universalist Church was in Oakland Park on 21st Avenue.
No, it was downtown before you moved here. It was downtown. They sold their building downtown.
Oh, wow.
But they used to be downtown, and on 6th, by the courthouse. But anyway, and so the Tuesday night group met in there. We were all sitting around, yes. So it tells you how things change from a sheriff deputy coming to talk to us and using the queer word, referring to us, and to Ron Cochran, who was elected.
Now it's fashionable.
Now, well, the sheriff building is named after Ron Cochran.
Yes.
Yeah,
I mean, because he was such a great
David's getting off track from your question. So let me be the gadfly to answer your question, to stir the pot just a little bit more. Another example of the difficulties in the gay community was the shocking reality of the Versace murders being tied to what I think is a marvelously respectable gay social fraternity of older men called Gamma Mu, who donate money every single year to marvelous charities and scholarships, and ask only of their members that they gather socially and quarterly on a basis to share their lives and experiences. And they travel all over the country, from San Diego to South Florida. Richard Fasenmeyer at the Cathode Ray used to host luncheons for them. Cliff Pettit still runs the group, marvelous group. I think wherever they meet, they just met. Great group. But Andrew Cunanan, the murderer of Gianni Versace, was rumored to have partaken as a young man in some of those trips with Gamma Mu. So Gamma Mu, which had considered itself a private gay social fraternity, never seeking notoriety or publicity, was suddenly not only in the national spotlight, but in an international spotlight that they never looked for, sought out, or wanted. And it was a very difficult time for the leadership of Gamma Mu, because it was heralded in a lot of the straight press as saying, oh, this is an organization that has older gay men using young prostitutes. So there's constantly battles that the gay community had to deal with back then. We wanted them to be looking for the murderer of 4 gay men, and you're reading articles, the secrets of Gamma Mu, and say, wait, aren't we going after the killer? I don't know how the next 8 or 10 episodes will shake out. I don't know how they film it.
Well, one thing I just want to comment on your question, though, that is the underlying assumption is that you're watching this thing about the Versace murder in Miami. Now, if this panel was being held in Miami, you would have a very different story, a very different set of facts and so on, a very different set of people up here. If this panel was being held up in Palm Beach County, okay, you would have, again, a very different set of people with a very different kind of story being told. So I think that illustrates something else that, when you talk about the community here in South Florida, well, there really is not a South Florida community. There is Miami, there's Broward, and there's Palm Beach. Now, some of you may disagree with me, but the disconnection among these counties is very significant.
Palpable.
But more my question was the time period, the 90s, and the disconnect between the police department and the gay community. That there was this big wall between them when crimes were happening, there wasn't, an outreach between the two communities.
Well,
and what you addressed
Yeah.
was that there was a bridge
Yeah.
that was being built.
It has to be built.
Ron
Yeah.
Cochran in 92.
Yeah,
Okay, another question, yes.
I don't know how relevant this is, but is there a connection or a synergy with the, let's say, the gay community at large and the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment? Because I haven't heard anything in the news for years about the Equal Rights
Well,
Amendment.
I'm not gonna be the expert on this, but I will say that when the gay rights movement was starting to evolve in our community, a lot of other attempts by groups seeking equal rights within the women's organization. I remember there were a number of protest signs that talked about abortion rights and that talked about equality for women. And we often used to talk about, well, is that part of the gay rights movement, or is, who's?
I'd like to speak to
Talk
that.
about that.
I'd
So,
like to just
because you
speak
remember
a
that,
little
don't you?
bit.
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing, feminist theory is recognized that the root of the hatred of gay men and the disparagement of gay men is because they're perceived to be like women. And so actually feminism, which many gay men think is a dirty word, it means we don't like men. It's not what it means. Maybe it does for some people, but that isn't what it means. That feminism should be part of the gay movement, but that's kind of been lost. Intellectuals, if you get the right magazines and read the right journals, intellectuals are still discussing that, and it's an issue, but it's not broadly conceived as part of the gay movement.
Well, you definitely
at all.
introduced it. You definitely introduced
Well,
it to the gay
I tried
right.
many
You did.
times,
I know.
much to my
I know. There was always
chagrin.
that struggle of trying to introduce feminism into the gay rights movement, and that was oftentimes cause of friction. But I don't know the answer to your question, and obviously experts don't know the answer
Well, it's
either.
not a question, it's a fact.
That-
The reason that straight men hate gay men, the ones that still do, and disparage them,
Yeah.
is because you're perceived to be like women. You're
And so they-
pussies,
and so they
you're
resent
So we're
it.
mean,
second-class
you're-
citizens?
So they
That's
resent it.
it's linked to misogyny, it's linked to hating women. That's
So that's why
why
you're saying they-
straight people don't like gay men, because you're like women. That's why it was easier for them to take me as a lesbian. Well, I used to be a really good, much better looking, and straight men, how they are. But it's because I wasn't a girly man. I was a woman. Yes, I was a lesbian, but that's kind of sexy. But I wasn't a girly man, and that was the crux of the problem. And that's why I was chosen to be the Trojan horse and to be the face of gay Broward County in the 90s, because I was not offensive to the people that we were hoping to curry favor with. And that's all about disliking misogyny. And so
Interesting.
it should be part of the gay rights movement, but I do not believe it is.
Okay, next question.
Hold on.
Good evening. It was very
One
interesting.
second, I'm sorry. Okay, go ahead. No, you're fine, go ahead.
So, good evening. It's very nice to hear the conversation. My name is Miriam, and I came here in '96. And I tried to be part of the Pride Center. I was being used as a token. I was a woman, professional. They loved when I wrote my checks, certainly. But they never gave me a voice. I remember many times sitting at board meetings and not being able to even utter a word because, no, I'll get to you later. And so with the past that you have all illustrated for us this evening, and we're on the precipice of probably having a gay mayor in our city, and that will propel our city even further. What lessons from the past should we be able to help us launch forward a better movement, a better recognition, and a better force for the gay community. Because the acrimony that we're seeing now tonight is not going to be helpful. Half the audience is gray-haired. So we need to enlist younger people to push forward our values and what we need to correct in our society. Because I don't think the 45th president is going to help me. If anything, he will push back what we have gained in the last 2 years. So some constructive ideas to help us move forward would be really appreciated. Thank you.
Well, I just want to say, from not answering your question exactly, but one of the issues that I often wonder about is that the young people have grown up in an environment where it is not so awful to be gay, and we are being mainstreamed. We're all getting married as fast as we can, and the lesbians move out to Weston and Tamarack and all that, and we're mainstreaming like crazy. And I just wonder if this probably isn't answering your question at all, but it's my question: is that are we going to be able to retain the unique gay culture that we have developed
Are we diluting
in this
ourselves?
past century?
Are we diluting our culture?
Yes, are we just gonna be mainstreamed out? I had always hoped before we got gay marriage, I was of the mind that we were going to insinuate ourselves into straight culture and raise them up and make them more like us, to make them better, more sensitive,
What happened?
better dressers.
What happened? What happened?
But I
We
don't know.
we
What is
became
happening?
them.
What
We
is
became
happening?
them.
Are we?
There's a phrase, you become a likeness of that which you abhor. I want to
Who says
answer
that?
your question.
Morgan.
I want to answer your question directly, because it's very poignant over what happened here for a little while with some of the constituents here that apparently have some history in politics. I said I've always been a journalist, a gadfly from the outside, haven't been involved in politics as much, because I've seen these fights over the years, covering them. You like the stories. As an anecdote, I became a board member of the National Organization to Reform Marijuana Laws in 1998, 20 years ago. Quickly, the day I got elected, I got, you get nominated, elected, they give you a round of applause. Somebody knocks on the door, it's a process server, and he's suing the board of directors of Normal because he got kicked off. So I had been a member of the Normal board for 60 seconds before I got sued, because they were having these internecine rivalries amongst themselves. But you know what? Marijuana, 20 years later, is now legal in 24 states. We overcame the acrimony. We overcame the adversity. I would like to think the individual feuds resurrected here tonight can be laughed at over a glass of wine, and maybe in the America I want to see with a loose joint next year. Medical, of course.
Well, let's answer my question. We haven't answered her question.
So the way to do it, to get it to a point and end, is you overcome the difficulties, and with determination, you move ahead and realize one thing that I've said in 100 editorials: we all have a lot more in common than we do apart, and we work together, channel our differences as adults, address them as respectfully as we can, not tweet out insults in the middle of the night like a juvenile in the White House, but rise, as Dean said earlier, citing that TV show. When we rise, we will overcome that, and we'll move forward. I guess all I was trying to point out earlier is, of course, we're going to have difficulties amongst ourselves, but we have the determination to proceed. I've got to compliment Fred. My first job down here was as a sociology professor at FAU. And the chairman of the department came up to me and said, "I'm not sure we should have a gay man teaching sociology. How can you be teaching the history of deviancy if you're one of the deviants. This is what the dean of the department said to me in the social science building. I said, well, who's gonna know more about it? But that really happened to me in 1978. And now here's a man who's not only written books or chapters about LGBTQ rights in Broward County, as did Alan Turl, the man Dean mentioned before. He's teaching a class on LGBTQ studies.
Yeah. Okay, I just want to respond, as somebody who is, I gotta say, it's very exceptional for me to be in a room of people who are all roughly my age, because I've spent the last 35 years basically being in rooms of people who are between the ages of 18 and 27. And that's sort of my guiding point or my focus point. But on the other hand, having taught college for the last 35 years and having taught lesbian gay studies for the last 30 years, I've seen both a change and an evolution in the community. Now, I would like to say to your question is that among the college generation today, I would like to think that they would not let what you're saying happen, because that sounds very much like a generational expression. Older men basically, this is how we treat women. I don't see that happening in younger people today. I'm not saying that there's no sexism or there doesn't have its problems, but it's not that same kind of assumption. It says that, oh, just sit there and be quiet. Okay. The second thing in terms of lesbian and gay students, to ask your question, or your question is the culture being, diluted or whatever. Well, one of the things is compare us to other minority groups. I mean, you're African American, you're born in an African American family, you're raised maybe in an African American neighborhood, you basically go to a church. All right, yeah, you maintain the culture. On the other hand, if you're gay or lesbian, are you born in a gay family? Are you born in a lesbian family? No. That's something in many ways you sort of discover yourself. Typically what happens is that when you come to that point of really sort of shaping who you are, you go back to, I'm Jewish, I'm middle class, I'm white, I'm African American. And that's what shapes your identity, your culture. And this kind of allegiance to, quote, the gay culture is nowhere near as strong as your connection to these other kinds of cultural sources in your life.
Well, that may be true for you, but that's not true for me.
Okay.
My primary identification is with the gay community, and I don't say lesbian because I'm not a feminist first. I'm gay first. And I'm very politically correct not to say it that way, but bottom line, I'm gay. And that has defined my life, and it's defined my dead brother's life, and it's defined all those dead guys, gay guys that died from AIDS, and it's defined everybody in this room, whether you recognize it as your primary culture or not. It defines our life, and it continues to define our life. I have recently gone through some issues. I've been going to the same gym, yes, you can go to the gym and still be fat, for well over 10 years. And I have had a trainer for at least 8 years. But
I would change train.
Well, I recently did, but it wasn't because my own choice. It wasn't my own choice. I had, to make a long story short, briefly had this young woman trainer, and she didn't want to train me because I'm a lesbian. So the next trainer was a young straight guy, 24, and I had a birthday. I love him. But when I interviewed him, I said, well, I have some questions for you, I said, one, I hate President Trump. He said, I'm okay with that. He's an independent. And then I said, oh, wait, and then wait, there's more. I said, I'm a lesbian, and I talk about it. He said, well, so what? But then I'm getting to know him, and it's interesting because things really have changed. Because, I don't have a lot of interaction with young kids, different from you. Yeah. But this guy, I see him 3 or 4 days a week. And he does some catering for stores. And he asked me, he said, why, how come the guys that are married at these parties call their husband their partner? And I said, well, probably because you're straight and they don't know where you're coming from, and they don't want it, they feel like if they say husband to you, it's like throwing it in your face. And actually then, I changed because of him, because I find myself self-censoring and saying partner a lot of times, because to say my wife to some straight people just don't get it. And now I bring it up. I go to the doctor, the guy's taking my blood pressure. This is my wife. I said, have you ever heard anybody come in and introduce their wife before? No. I said, yeah, well, you know what? That's because we're afraid you're gonna hate us. And I'm all about it all over. The personal is political. I'm changing the world, but the kids have changed. Not that the guy who's taking my blood dislikes me because I have a wife, but he never heard it before. And so, you know, we still have a lot of work.
I think we're all still getting used to that. Even amongst ourselves, we're still.
I know. Well, I just am so hopeful. Honest to God, in the 90s, I went to give, I'm gonna shut up in 1 second. I went to give a speech at the BPG, Business and Professional Group, gay, all gay, but they call themselves that. They're still around, but they're shrunk, because they let straight people in and it messed it up. But that's what happened. I watched it. But in the 90s, after some of our big successes, they invited me to speak. And I went to the DoubleTree on Sunset. Is that what that was?
Sunrise.
Yeah, anyway, yeah, Sunrise. So I still think I'm in LA. So I went in and I said, I'm trying to find the gay breakfast group at the desk. And they said, we don't have a gay breakfast group. I said, yeah, you do. I'm here to speak. No, we don't have it. We don't have it. We don't have it. Well, I'm looking around. I go around the corner. There's like 100 guys. 100 guys. Well, there was the gay breakfast group.
Can I just?
But anyway, we've come a long way.
Yeah. Wait, there's somebody else, but just quickly, very quickly, yeah.
Okay. You know, the gay community is still trying to identify role models. And I think with each passing year and each new accomplishment, we are able to identify role models in our community, whether it be political, whether it be professional. I've been here about 36 years, and the role models that I have seen in our community have evolved over time. And a lot of those people who started out also felt like they didn't fit in either, and that they were kept out, either psychologically or just abruptly, just said, this place isn't for you. I know in the real estate profession, a lot of people just felt they weren't going to be included, yet now you see a proliferation of LGBT, well, at least gay and lesbian realtors, and whether it be, whatever it may be. And so I think that in order to be included, we have to understand that human beings are going to be human beings no matter how we are. There are personality conflicts, there are always going to be financial challenges, and there are also all these things that kind of become hurdles in our path to success. So I think that we have to have the determination internally, personally, to be able to overcome those things. Don't feel shuttered out by things that may come up in a meeting or harsh dialogue, because in the end, it's not intended to turn people off. It's intended to create you as a role model. And ultimately, we all evolve in that area, and I think that's where our success is. So, like Robin said, or Norman said, these are just family squabbles. They aren't meant to hurt. They're not meant to hold anybody back. And I just think that we as a community always need to look at ourselves that way, because we are together. We are a community. This is our culture, and we have ourselves to rely on, because no one else is there for us.
Okay, thank you. Okay, sir.
My question relates to the Broward County and the significance of the geographic region. How challenging has it been to advance the community with the reputation of South Florida and the party atmosphere? I mean, the recent cruise ship, there seems to be a cruise ship story every year with problems, and the knee-jerk reaction is, well, it's a gay cruise. This is why this happened. So my question is, compared to Chicago or New York or LA, has your journey been more difficult because of the party and the tourism that South Florida is associated with?
I don't know how to answer that. I mean, you're asking us, have we been victims of homophobia because of the culture that others perceive that we live in? Because everybody lives in the culture you describe in different ways. Not everybody sitting here is a hedonist. Not everybody here, is going to go on a party cruise and have a friend that dies from an overdose of drugs. A lot of people shun that kind of lifestyle. In fact, most gay people, I think, do, and especially as you get older. But the question is well-founded. We never know. Like, did I ever get denied a job at a law firm that I applied to because they thought I was just going to be a party animal and they didn't want me around? I don't know the answer to that question. It's a good point, though. It's very difficult to gauge the discriminatory environment in which you find yourself, and that's why when we talk about our community, we've all grown up in this community, right? We've all seen it evolve in terms of numbers, in terms of strength, in terms of vitality and goals. We now have role models. We now have people that stand out in their own profession. So can we push that other stuff aside? Can we push the discrimination aside? Never, unfortunately, because it always rears its ugly head in one form or another. But we can stick together and try to dissuade each generation into attaching itself to those awful beliefs. And I think that as Americans here living in Fort Lauderdale or in the surrounding area, these are the types of things that we need through education, through example, that we need to say, the straight world parties just as much as the gay world. That, for some reason,
Exactly.
right?
Why are they always pointing at us that we're the big partiers?
Right, exactly.
That's baloney. It's not true.
Yeah.
Look at these frat houses and the things that happen in those houses and what they do to the girls and how they overdose their young men on alcohol and the paddle parties the high school people do. They torture each other. Those aren't gay people. Those aren't gay people, so I'm not sure I understand the question.
No, he's right, and we are.
There is a focus on
a stereotype.
If we misbehave, that's what it becomes.
If a certain group misbehaves, because it's not all of us.
No.
So John, before you step away, that brings up another point though, because when you do achieve a level of success, okay, or position of authority, we are now expected to, in order to prove ourselves, we have to be better than if a straight person did it. And so, so if a person achieves a level of success in their profession, whether it be a lawyer or whether it be an accountant or whatever, in many cases, for you to be accepted, you got to do better than the average person because people are constantly, looking over your shoulder and thinking, well, oh, they're gay, so they're not going to be able to measure up to the task. Same in politics. God willing, should I become mayor, I'm going to be judged by a much different standard than any of my predecessors. And I realize that risk, but I know I have you all to help me. So, but honestly, that's a risk that anyone in a position of authority has to take in our community.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Dean. How are you tonight?
Good, Susan.
Okay. Is there anyone else here that's transsexual besides me?
Over there?
Curious.
Yeah.
The gentleman behind you.
Emery.
Emery.
Female to male? Yes. Okay. That's it. There's so much I could complain about. I would start with LGBT, which is totally wrong. It should be LGBT and T, because LG and B all have something in common, which of course is sexual attraction. Transgender is completely different. And the unfortunate thing about that, you'll have to excuse my voice. I recently had male to female vocal cord surgery and I'm still recovering. Whereas most of us trans understand LGB, most LGB have no clue. And that's been my experience. I worked as a volunteer 4 days a week at the Pride Center. these organizations and you call yourself LGBT. Let me ask you a question. A gay applies for a job and there's a background check. Is there going to be anything on that background check that's going to alert the employer that that person is gay? Answer.
Yes.
What on that background check could
If they're married to another man, they would have that man on the thing. If, on the other hand, if in 1995 he was picked up by the Miami police or the Fort Lauderdale police for soliciting, there would be that kind of, criminal record on his background check if it was there. And you can go on and on and on and on and on, all right? If there was a civil case with regarding to an adoption, if there was a divorce in which it came out that he was, quote, gay, that's on the record. So the point is, I can go
think we're all aware of that, but unfortunately it misses the point.
Allow me to interject here. I want to say this. I want to say that in general, if you're gay, you can pass unless you have one of these extenuating circumstances. And the society is evolving. It's going to be better in 10 years. Right now we are having a setback. The society is evolving on the issue of transgender. It's in its baby steps for the last 10 years. And as I got distracted before about saying my optimism, I was talking to the BPG about the wave that we're on. The wave into the future where it's going to consistently get better and better for us. And that absolutely transgender is at the forefront of that growth now, and it has way far to go, but it's happening. So you just, I understand your anger, your resentment, the feelings of being left out and not respected, and on and on and on. But it is changing, and people are evolving.
There is a feeling that transgenders are controlled, and the gay community is a large part of that. But getting back to my question, on my background check, okay, it's going to say Susan Alicia Matzner, and then underneath it or above it, it's going to say Robert Joseph Matzner. And then it's going to say Robert Joseph Matzner, a male, Susan Alicia Matzner, a female. And that pretty much follows me. So right away, I cannot apply. Gays don't have that to the best of my knowledge.
No, they don't. They don't. And it may not be in your lifetime when this is no longer an issue.
Today's my birthday. Today's my birthday. I'm 74 years old.
You are
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Gee, thanks.
But, it's an evolving thing, and we don't have an answer. Well, nobody has an answer for that, an immediate answer for that. I don't.
Okay.
Unless it's the mayor.
Back in 2008.
Politician, not a philosopher.
Back in 2008, Ken Keachel wrote in addition to the Human Rights Ordinance that was supposed to protect people like me from job discrimination. And the Human Rights Board has gone and they've turned that around into a Transgender Control Act. So that if I'm fired from a job and I go to file a case, Eddie Labrador takes the part of the employer against me.
Well, that's the way that the Broward County Human Rights Board unfortunately functions, is that initially let me just address this question. Initially, the county...
You don't know the worst of it.
I know a lot about it because I was on the Human Rights Board. So
You don't know the worst of it,
I'm trying to tell you
ma'am.
something, and this really isn't the
Ma'am,
Or
you
for this,
don't know the worst
You need to
of
get
it.
your own attorney because Eddie Labrador is not representing you. That's it. That's the way it works. That's just
I
the
was
way
the
it works.
first case that they ever had, okay? I was fired by, Winn-Dixie. And what does Eddie Labrador do? He goes and he tells Winn-Dixie, just say that Susan resigned and she has no effing case. Can you believe that?
Yes. I used to be on the board. It is a lot of injustice. The way it's set up, it's deceptive to the person who's claiming because you think that the county is representing you, but they are not. So that's all I can say is you need to get your own attorney because the county does not represent you unless and until.
The county represents the employer.
I can't
They're
answer.
supposed to be neutral.
Susan, Robin is not here as your elected representative. She's here as an individual who's trying to give a history of gay rights over 30 or 40 years in Broward County. She gave
That's
you.
the problem.
Let me finish.
You need to take.
May I finish? I've listened to you. She's given you a very passionate, encouraging, initial, inspirational response when she said, these goals may not be achieved within your lifetime, but the wave and history is on your side. The tide is turning, whether it's Donald Trump or some right-wing Republican senator. We're gonna overcome those
talking
obstacles.
about
But we
Lauderdale.
can't in this panel
I'm
of
talking
5
about
people.
Fort
I know,
Lauderdale.
and I'm saying we can't in this panel of 5 people simply stop and talk about the individual issues of Susan Metzner. If you believe you have a story, then you should write it up, send it to one of my reporters, because those are the kinds of things we want to illuminate
Yeah, but Norm,
at the newspaper.
Norm, the problem is, her riding the wave and writing a story and being publicized doesn't get her a job and put food on the table. That's what she's suffering from, and that's the tragedy here. But
So how do you
but
correct that?
But we don't have an answer for you today. Obviously, the
But
transgender.
my problem
Susan,
is, I
Susan,
don't think you
Susan,
even know that
Susan,
these issues,
Susan,
I don't think you know these issues even exist.
And we
Do you
do
know
that they exist.
that-
Susan,
do
I have to
know
cut you
that
off.
Lois
Susan.
Wexler has banned me from contacting the
Susan.
Broward County?
Susan, this is not a forum to.
Well,
announce
where
your
is
point.
there gonna be a forum?
Okay, we understand what you're saying. I don't know if we've been able
There
to.
is no forum.
Okay, I don't know if we've been able to really answer your question, but I do know that we
You
accept
didn't
your
even know my
position that.
questions existed.
See, you only want to talk when someone else is talking. Have you stopped? So the point is that this group is here to talk about the history of the LGBT rights movement.
LGB, please, let's be
However you
honest.
want to, however you want to describe it. But the point is, that as Robin said, that we've lived a certain part of it, okay? And there's another part to be lived, all right? And another part to be endured, and another part to challenge. And that may not be our role. This tonight was just an opportunity to discuss the history and how we each were a part of it, and to talk about others who were not here tonight, what their part was in it, and how we've gotten to where we are today. And I can tell you right now that while we may not, some are more or less are obvious in their sexual orientation, I can tell you there were equal number of challenges and tragedies that gay people and lesbian people have suffered in the past that you today are suffering. So I'm not going to say that I share your suffering. I'm just going to say there has been suffering. I don't want you to suffer, but I feel that you are suffering today, and you are entitled to the respect and the dignity that each and every one of us in the room have been able to maintain in their lifetime. So let us all promise you tonight, and this will be the end of our program tonight, that we will endeavor to continue the equal rights movement as it now faces the challenge of transgender equality, and that's the next step in our community. That's the next step in Fort Lauderdale, and I can tell you we will all equally promise that we will all be part of that role. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here tonight.
You're so eloquent.
Why
You're
can't
pretty
someone
good
here
too.
pick up the phone, call Commissioner Lois Wexler, and say?
She's a congressman. Oh, Commissioner Lois Wexler, she's no longer a commissioner. She left office several years